Welcome everyone. Let's have a lesson on introduction to cytology. This is usually the first topic that you look at in biology for A level, or what we often call as advanced level biology. So we are going to look at what cytology is. Why do we really need to study cytology? And then we'll look at what cells are and the types of cells. So that is basically going to be our first session. And then from there we shall have other topics to do with looking at the tools that we use in studying cytology. That is microscopy. We shall look at the microscopes. And then from there, we'll look at the cells in detail, where we shall look at the different organelles and their functions. And then from there, we can look at cell processes, such as movement in and out of the cell. And then also cell processes like cell division will also be covered in this topic. Okay, so when we talk about the cell cytology, we want to basically know about cells, what is the structure of cells, what theory do we have to describe how all the major characteristics of cells, of all cells. So in that we are basically looking at what we call the cell theory and how it relates to evolution of life. And then we shall look at a concept to do with cell organization and the homeostasis, and then the relationship between cell size and homeostasis. Okay, so those are the objectives of this session. So everything that has life starts with the cell, and that is why we say that the cell is the basic functional and structure unit. Basic functional and structure unit. Okay, so that is to say that if you have organisms that have one cell, that one cell functions as a unit, as a complete organism. Okay, and that's why we call them unicellular organisms. That means that they can carry out all the processes that all living organisms do carry out, even when you only have it as one cell. Okay, so if you have many cells from an organism, then that's when you have multicellular organisms. Okay, so multicellular organisms and unicellular organisms carry out the same biological processes, which include respiration, growth, nutrition, other metabolic processes that lead to growth and development, excretion, and then also irritability. Okay, so these are what we call the biological processes. So regardless of whether you have an organism as a multicellular organism or a unicellular organism, they carry out these functions. So for us to basically understand how organisms function, how an organism functions, then we definitely need to understand the cell. Okay, so this understanding the cell allows us to understand how these different processes actually do happen. The branch of biology that is concerned with studying cells or studying the cell structure, function, and chemistry is what we call cytology. Okay, this cyto usually means a cell. Okay, now why are we very much interested in a cell? If we study the cell properly, It means that you will be able to know how complex organisms actually function, how different physiological processes take place, and also what makes up the structure, basically the structure of these organisms. Okay, the study of structure of organisms is what we call anatomy. Here, and then looking at when we study how biological processes happen or how the body works is what we call physiology. So if we understand the role of the cells in contributing to the structure of an organism and in contributing to how an organism functions, then we can know how the whole organism actually carries out different biological processes. Okay, like I said, biological processes are quite many. Irritability or coordination, homeostasis, excretion, nutrition, respiration, synthesis, and also breakdown of different molecules, biomolecules. Okay, so these are examples of biological processes. So if we really understand how the cell works, we can be able to know these processes properly. Okay. What we will also discover is that cells, we have different types of cells. They don't actually look the same. They don't actually also carry out the same functions. Okay, so cytology allows us to know the structure and the function of the different cells and what makes some cells suitable for certain functions and not others. Okay, and that is basically comes into when we talk about what we call cell differentiation or cell specialization. That we have cells that are suited for particular functions. Okay, the nerve cells, for example, are for transmitting impulses. The muscle cells are for contraction and relaxation to produce movements. Okay, and then the bone cells are also very important in producing. For example, if you look at the bone marrow where we have stem cells producing red blood cells and things like that, and also their role in calcium and phosphorus metabolism. Okay, so that means that different cells can carry out different functions because of their structure and or other physiological characteristics or other physiological properties that they really have. Okay, so we have what we call biological organization. With biological organization is that we actually start with molecules, or actually not even elements. We start with atoms, and then atoms form the elements, and then the elements form compounds, and then the compounds now are the ones that will connect us to what we call organelles, and then organelles we have the cellular level, and then from the cellular level you go to the tissue level, and then organ system, and then you move to the organism. Okay, so that this is definitely to say that it's good for us to look at cells such that we can really appreciate how complex organisms are. That is point number 5. And then the structure of different cells can give us information on where these cells actually came from, which cells are advanced and which cells are primitive. When we talk about that, we are referring to the fact that cells are not of the same complexity. We have cells that are more complex than others. Okay, so that means that the cells that are more complex, for them they have undergone evolutionary changes. So they are cells of advanced organisms. And then those that are low in terms of complexity, what we often call as primitive organisms. That means that they have cells that are not really very complex. And therefore, when we look at cells in general, we can say, okay, this cell is for a primitive or lower organism, and then this cell is for a higher organism, or what we call complex organisms. Okay, so that is why the cytology is very important. And then inside the cells, we have what we call genetic material, often contained in the DNA and RNA. So when we study cytology, we can be able to basically describe this genetic material in terms of structure and how this genetic material is actually transferred from the parents to the young ones. And then we also have the fact that if we look at the structure of cells, you can be able to know what is happening to someone's body. For example, if you are anemic, they can take your blood sample and then view that blood sample in a microscope, and then they will be able to tell you that your red blood cells are very small in size. So you're actually suffering from anemia. You have anemia. Or when they look at your red blood cells, they say that your red blood cells are not shaped properly, just like in sickle cell. So they can basically tell you the disease you're suffering from if they look at the structure of cells. Okay, and also, for example, if you have what we call leukemia, okay, cancer that is associated with white blood cells. Still, when they look at these white blood cells, they can be able to say that you are having this type of cancer, blood cancer. So that means that cytology is very important in enabling us to understand what diseases are happening in your body. So how did we come to know about cells? Okay, how did we come to know about cells? As scientists, we actually rely on work that has been done by other people. Okay, so the first people who really did a lot of work in areas to do with cells developed for us a theory that we call the cell theory. And this cell theory is what is actually widely accepted. And what is this cell theory all about? It's basically about the fact that all organisms, regardless of whether they are complex or primitive organisms, or what we call lower or higher organisms, all organisms basically have cells. That's the first point with the cell theory. The second point is that the cell is basically the functional or the basic unit. Remember I said it's the functional structure unit of life. Everything about life starts with the cell. And then the third main point about the cell theory is that new cells arise from pre-existing cells. Okay? So the new cells don't drop from heaven, they come from other cells that are already existing. That's point number 3. Okay? So of course that explanation was the initial explanation about what cells are, and subsequently more additions have been added as the technology advances. More knowledge about cells continue to be developed. Okay, and therefore additions have been made to this cell theory. And those additions are that actually cells contain genetic material, basically DNA, for heredity. This is therefore to say that genetic information is passed from the parent cell to the daughter cell through the DNA. Okay? And then the next point is that within cells, we have energy flow and metabolic processes. The metabolic processes of life that I have described earlier on occur within the cell. And what the cells consist are basically the same things at the element level. Okay? If you get each cell and look at it, at what each cell consists, definitely you'll find out that there is carbon, there is oxygen, there is hydrogen. There are also other, even nitrogen, if I'm not mentioning it. Okay, these elements are the same in all cells. So that's why we are saying that all cells share an elemental chemical composition. Okay, that's the point there. If you have an organism that has more than one cell, the ones we term as multicellular organisms, these cells that make up this multicellular organism actually work together. They don't work in isolation. That is something to note there. That when we have, for example, the muscle cells are concerned with bringing about contraction and relaxation, and therefore enabling movement. But these muscles do not work if you don't have nerve cells that supply these muscles. And these muscles don't work if they don't have sufficient blood supply, because they have to get nutrients through the blood supply, including gases. And also, the waste products have to be removed from these muscles. So this is an example of how these different muscles or these different cells actually have to work together to achieve physiological functions. Now, earlier on, we said that the cell theory notes that new cells come from those that are already existing. The new addition that we have here is that actually those new cells coming from the pre-existing cells, they arise through a process of cell division. And this cell division can be mitosis or meiosis. Okay? But of course, when you look at reproduction, you also see other processes that can result into new cells. Issues like issues to do with budding, issues to do with fragmentation. You will see them in the production. But definitely here we are emphasizing that cell division happens, and you have mitotic cell division and meiotic cell division. So all cells are basically a fundamental unit of life. We all know that. With no cells, we don't have life. And these cells consist of different components. And most of these cells definitely will have proteins, nucleic acids. And under the nucleic acids, it's basically with the RNA and the DNA that we talked about. And we talked about this in relation to the genetic material. And then we also have the carbohydrates. Okay? So, how are cells organized? Just look at your house or your room. your room has to be organized in a particular way. And one of the ways you can ensure that your room is organized is to ensure that you have control over what enters your room and what gets out of your room. So it's the same thing with the cell. For the cell to maintain organization, it has to control what gets into it and what gets out. If it does not control that, then we will have a homeostatic problem. Homeostasis is the process of maintaining a constant internal environment. What that means is that if there are changes within the surrounding of the cell, the inside environment should not really change. Okay? So homeostasis is to resist that change, to make sure that there is a constant internal environment, regardless of the changes in the external environment. Okay, so that means that it is very, very important for the cell to maintain its internal environment, because you can only control what is under your control. You may not necessarily control what is outside your control. So the cell may not have control about the external environment, but it can control to some extent, definitely, the internal environment. So the gatekeeper, okay, the gatekeeper, just like your door, if you want to control what goes in and out of your room, you have to lock your door, right? So the gatekeeper for the cell is actually the plasma membrane. It's the one that controls what comes in and what goes out. And then also we have other structures within the cell that can play a role in maintaining the internal environment. And those structures are the ones that we call the organelles. They are very specialized, that you have different organelles doing different functions, and we shall look at them in our subsequent sessions, where we shall look at the internal structure of cells in details. We shall look at the plant cell and the animal cell, and these organelles that are inside these cells. What are their structures? We shall look at that definitely. Okay. Another thing for organization is about keeping information, and the organisms keep information about themselves, and they pass that information to the next generation or to the new ones. That information is the one that is contained in the DNA, and before that information, the genetic information. Or we can actually call it the genetic instruction. Okay, and this the genetic instruction is contained in the genetic material, often the DNA, but we can also talk about the RNA. And this genetic material, regardless of how complex the organism is actually contained in a specialized or in a specific region of the cell. So you don't have the genetic material just anywhere within the cell. No, there is always a special area. For example, for plants and animals, you will have the genetic material in the nucleus of the cell. How big are cells? Cells are actually very small. So do cells wish to be large? They would wish to be large, but there are limitations to being large. If the cell becomes large, it means that it's going to have a low surface area to volume ratio. A low surface area to volume ratio. Okay? So when an organism or when a cell has a low surface area to volume ratio, it becomes very hard for it to obtain nutrients, even gases, or even get rid of waste products. So that's the challenge. Okay, that is the challenge. Okay, so that means that the cell being smaller is what is actually better, because eventually it will have a large surface area to volume ratio. And I want you to try out this. I want you to find the surface area of this tube, for example. Okay, length times width times the number of sides that you have, 6 sides, times the number of tubes that you have. Let me say tube, C is for tubes. You get the surface area for this, for each, for A and B. And then you get the volume. Okay? You get the volume, length times width times height times the number of tubes that you have. Okay, the number of tubes which I said is C. So you get the surface area to volume ratio for A, and then you get the surface area to volume ratio of B. Here the tubes are 8. Here we have 1 tube. Definitely, if you do the calculations right, you realize that the smaller tubes have a larger surface area to volume ratio. And therefore, organisms that have smaller size, or cells that have smaller sizes, are the ones that are going to have a large volume ratio, surface area to volume ratio, and therefore they become very efficient in the exchange of material. That is, they can easily get nutrients. They can also easily make waste products to move away. But we also have cells that, apart from being small, they have the adaptation of having extensions. So, for example, cells that line the GIT have what we call the microvilli. These projections increase the surface area, and therefore it means that absorption is much more efficient there. Okay, so not all the cells are the same. The cells have different structures, and that allow them to perform different functions. So the different structures can range from the unique features that they have, or how uniquely they are shaped. For example, this is a nerve cell that you can see there. It has extensions, very many of them. So that allows them to carry out the function of transmission of impulses. Okay, but of course it has synapses and many other things. Okay, for example, the sperm cells have what we call the flagellar movement. So different cells have different adaptations to their function. Now this is where we introduce 2 main types of cells, what we call the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes, or what we call the prokaryotic cells and the eukaryotic cells. These ones here are the less advanced, lower cells. These ones are the advanced cells. So in terms of evolutionary history, these ones are higher than these. So lower organisms like the bacteria are the ones that have this type of cells. And then advanced organisms are the ones that have the eukaryotic cell. The major distinguishing feature is that the prokaryotic cell lack what you call a membrane-bound nucleus. Okay, they lack a well-defined nucleus. When we say defined, it means that it's a boundary, it's bounded. That's what we say, membrane-bounded nucleus. Or we can actually also use the word membrane-bounded organelles. Okay, we can also use that. That is the major distinguishing factor, or major distinguishing characteristic for these cells. Okay, but of course we shall look at them in detail and see what other differences are there. Where is for example, the genetic material stored? Okay, what are the unique features that prokaryotes have? That is, the cells that are prokaryotic, and what are the cells that are prokaryotic? What are the unique features that they have that prokaryotic cells do not have? We shall look at that in detail. But basically, plants, animals, the protists, and then the fungi or fungus, they have prokaryotic cells, and then the bacteria and the blue-green algae are the ones that have a prokaryotic cell. Okay, so that marks the end of this first session.